"What would you do if your wife's best friend sent you proof of a months-long affair?" I replied, "I know. Thanks for confirming." Then forwarded everything to her entire family group chat. What happened next destroyed 2 careers in one night. My name is Rey Cross, and I work as a real estate agent specializing in title documentation and contract forensics, which means I spend most of my days reviewing property records, verifying ownership chains, and identifying discrepancies in legal documents that could derail a sale or expose a buyer to future liability. Most people think real estate agents just show houses and negotiate prices, but the truth is that the most important work happens in the back office, where you're cross-referencing deed records against tax assessments, checking for liens and encumbrances, and making sure that every signature on every document is legitimate and properly notarized, because one forged signature or one missed lien can turn a dream home into a legal nightmare that takes years and tens of thousands of dollars to resolve. I learned this meticulous attention to detail during my previous career as a paralegal at a mid-sized law firm, where I worked in the litigation department and spent countless hours building case files, organizing evidence chronologically, and identifying inconsistencies in witness statements that could be used to impeach testimony or establish patterns of deception. My wife Amaris worked as a junior manager at a boutique consulting firm downtown, the kind of place where everyone dressed in expensive business casual and talked about synergizing deliverables and optimizing stakeholder engagement in meetings that could have been handled with a single email, and she was good at her job in the way that people who are naturally charismatic and socially adept tend to excel in environments where perception and networking matter more than technical expertise. We had been married for 5 years, together for 7, and for most of that time I had believed we had a solid partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals. Even though we had very different working styles and social needs, I preferred quiet evenings at home, reviewing contracts and researching property law updates, while Amaris thrived on after-work networking events, client dinners, and the kind of social interactions that left me feeling drained and overstimulated. I had always told myself that these differences were complementary rather than problematic, that a successful marriage required each partner to have their own interests and social circles, and that it was healthy for us to maintain some degree of independence rather than expecting to do everything together. On the night that everything changed, I was working late in my home office, which was really just a converted section of our garage that I had outfitted with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a commercial-grade printer scanner that I use for processing client documents, and I was reviewing a particularly complex title search for a commercial property sale that was scheduled to close in 3 days. The property had changed hands 6 times in the past 15 years, and each transfer had introduced new complications, easements that hadn't been properly recorded, boundary disputes that had been settled informally without updating the official plat maps, and a series of mechanics liens that had been filed and released but not properly documented in the county records. I was deep into cross-referencing the current survey against historical aerial photographs to verify that a disputed fence line hadn't been moved over the years when my phone vibrated on the desk beside me, and I glanced at the screen expecting to see a message from a client or my broker. But instead, I saw a text notification from Harper Mitchell, who was Amaris's best friend from college and someone I had always liked despite finding her a bit too intense and emotionally volatile for my taste. The preview on my lock screen showed just the beginning of Harper's message. "Ray, we need to talk. This is urgent." Followed by a notification that she had sent 4 image attachments, and my first thought was that something had happened to Amaris, that there had been an accident or a medical emergency, and Harper was reaching out because she couldn't get through to me on a regular call. I unlocked my phone immediately and opened the full message thread, and what I saw made my stomach drop and my hands go cold, even though some distant analytical part of my brain had probably been expecting something like this for months, even if I hadn't been willing to consciously acknowledge the pattern of small warning signs that had been accumulating like evidence in a case file that I hadn't wanted to open. The 4 screenshots that Harper had sent were text message conversations between Amaris and someone whose contact name in her phone was just L, and even before I read the content of the messages, I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at evidence of an affair, because there was a particular tone and intimacy to the messages that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. The first screenshot showed a conversation from 3 weeks ago where Amaris had written, "He's working late again, should be in the garage until at least 11, and the response from L had been, 'Perfect, I'll come over around 9, bring wine,' followed by a wine glass emoji and a heart." The second screenshot was from a month before that, showing Amaris writing, "Booked the hotel for Friday night, told him I have a work retreat in the mountains, he didn't even question it," and L responding, "You're getting good at this, maybe too good," with a laughing emoji. The third screenshot showed a more recent exchange where Amaris had written, "Harper's getting suspicious. She asked me point blank if something was going on. I told her she was being paranoid, but I think she knows." And L had responded, "Do we need to be more careful, or is it time to just tell them?" The fourth screenshot was the most damning, a conversation from just 2 days ago where Amaris had written, "I feel guilty sometimes, but then I remember how happy you make me and how Ray is always buried in his work and never has time for me anyway." And Elle had responded, "You deserve to be happy. We both do. And if they can't see what they have, then that's their problem, not ours." I sat there in my garage office staring at those 4 screenshots for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, and I felt a strange disconnect between my emotional response, which was a mixture of hurt and anger and betrayal, and my analytical response, which immediately started cataloging the evidence and cross-referencing it against my memories of the past few months to establish a timeline and identify corroborating details. I thought about all the evenings when Amaris had come home late with explanations about client dinners and project deadlines, and how I had accepted those explanations without question because I trusted her, and because I was often working late myself and didn't have any reason to doubt her word. I thought about the weekend a month ago, when she had told me about a mandatory work retreat in the mountains, and how I had encouraged her to go and enjoy some time away from the office, and how she had come back on Sunday evening looking relaxed and happy in a way that I had attributed to the benefits of a weekend in nature, but that now took on a completely different and more painful meaning. My phone vibrated again with a new message from Harper that read, "I'm so sorry, Ray. I didn't know if you knew or not. I've been agonizing over whether to tell you for weeks, but I can't keep lying for her anymore. She asked me to cover for her multiple times, and I feel sick about it. And I realize that Harper's guilt and her need to confess were probably motivated as much by her own desire to relieve her conscience as by any genuine concern for my well-being. But I also recognize that her decision to send me these screenshots represented a significant breach of her friendship with Amaris, and that she wouldn't have done it unless she genuinely believed it was the right thing to do." I typed out a response, keeping my tone calm and factual, even though my hands were shaking slightly as I held the phone, and I wrote, "I know. Thanks for confirming." Which was only partially true because while I had suspected that something was wrong in my marriage, I hadn't had concrete proof until this moment, and I hadn't known the specific details about who Amaris was involved with, or how long it had been going on, or how elaborate the deception had been. Harper responded immediately with, "You knew? How long have you known? Are you okay? Do you want to talk?" And I could sense the anxiety and confusion in her rapid-fire questions, but I didn't want to get drawn into a lengthy conversation with her about my feelings or my plans, because I had already made a decision about what I was going to do next, and that decision required me to act quickly before Amaris came home, and before I had time to second-guess myself or to let my emotions override my strategic thinking. I saved all 4 of Harper's screenshots to my phone's camera roll, and then I opened my text messaging app and navigated to the family group chat that Amaris had created 2 years ago as a way to keep her parents and her younger sister Rebecca updated on family news and to coordinate holiday gatherings and birthday celebrations. The group chat was called the Hartley family after Amaris's maiden name, and it included Amaris, her mother Diane, her father Robert, her sister Rebecca, and me, and it was typically used for innocuous messages about dinner plans and vacation schedules and photos of family events. I selected all 4 screenshots that Harper had sent me, and I attached them to a new message in the family group chat, and I didn't add any commentary or explanation because I felt that the images spoke for themselves and that any attempt to editorialize or to provide context would only dilute their impact and give Amaris an opportunity to spin the narrative or to claim that I was misinterpreting innocent messages. My finger hovered over the send button for just a moment as I considered the irreversible nature of what I was about to do, and the fact that once I sent these images to Amaris's family, there would be no way to take them back or to handle this situation privately. But then I thought about the 4 months of systematic deception that the screenshots represented, and about the fact that Amaris had been willing to involve Harper in her lies and to use our home as a meeting place for her affair while I was working just a few yards away in the garage, and I pressed send and watched as the 4 images uploaded to the group chat and the message status changed from sending to delivered to read, as each member of the family opened the chat and saw what I had shared. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with my phone starting to vibrate continuously as messages flooded into the group chat faster than I could read them, and I saw Diane's name appear with "Call me now" in all capital letters, followed by Rebecca writing, "What is this?" Amaris, "What the hell?" and Robert writing, "Everyone stop and take a breath. We need to talk about this calmly." But I didn't read any further because I had already silenced my phone and set it face down on my desk, and I turned my attention back to the title search documents that I had been working on before Harper's message had arrived, because I found that focusing on the methodical work of verifying property records and cross-referencing legal descriptions was the only way I could keep myself from spiraling into an emotional reaction that wouldn't serve any productive purpose. I worked on the title search for another 45 minutes, forcing myself to concentrate on the boundary dispute documentation and the timeline of ownership transfers, and the familiar routine of comparing legal descriptions against survey plats helped to quiet the adrenaline that was making my hands shake and my heart race. Even though I knew that this calm was artificial and that I would eventually have to deal with the emotional fallout of what I had just set in motion. My phone continued to vibrate periodically on the desk beside me, the screen lighting up with incoming notifications that I could see peripherally but refused to look at directly. And I could tell from the frequency of the vibrations that the family group chat had exploded into what was probably a combination of shock, confusion, angry demands for explanation, and frantic attempts to understand what was happening and whether the screenshots I had shared were authentic or somehow manipulated. Around 10:30, I heard the sound of Amaris's car pulling into the driveway, and I glanced up from my work to see through the garage window as her headlights swept across the side of the house and then went dark, and I heard her car door open and close and then the distinctive jingle of her keys as she walked toward the front door of the house rather than coming through the garage where she would have seen me sitting at my desk. I waited and listened, and I heard the front door open and close, and then there was a moment of silence followed by what sounded like Amaris gasping or making some other sharp vocalization of surprise or distress, and I knew that she had just pulled out her phone and seen the explosion of messages in the family group chat, and that she was now staring at the screenshots that I had forwarded from Harper, and trying to process the fact that her affair had been exposed not just to me, but to her entire immediate family simultaneously. I heard her footsteps moving quickly through the house, and then I heard her voice calling my name with a tone of panic and desperation that I had never heard from her before. And she called out, "Ray? Ray, where are you? We need to talk right now." But I didn't respond or move from my desk, and I simply continued working on the title search document as if I hadn't heard her at all, because I had learned from my years as a paralegal that silence and refusal to engage can be more powerful than any argument or confrontation, and that sometimes the best way to win a dispute is to simply let the other side exhaust themselves trying to provoke a reaction. Amaris must have realized that I was in the garage office because I heard the interior through a conversation about my concerns. Amaris opened her mouth to respond and then closed it again, and I could see that she was struggling to come up with a response that would explain away the specific details I had just cited, and after a moment she shifted tactics and said, "Fine, okay. I admit that I've been spending time with Lucas and that maybe I wasn't completely honest with you about the nature of our relationship, but that's because you've been completely checked out of our marriage for the past year. You're always working late or buried in your property records or researching some obscure title law, and you never have time or energy for me or for our relationship. So is it really that surprising that I found someone who actually pays attention to me and makes me feel valued and appreciated?" I felt a flash of anger at this attempt to shift blame and to reframe her betrayal as somehow being my fault for not being attentive enough, but I kept my voice calm and said, "If you were unhappy in our marriage, then you had multiple options available to you, including talking to me about your concerns, suggesting that we try couples counseling, or even asking for a separation if you felt the relationship was no longer working. But what you chose to do instead was to maintain the appearance of a normal marriage while simultaneously conducting a secret relationship with someone else and lying to me repeatedly about where you were and what you were doing. So no, I don't accept the premise that your affair was somehow a reasonable response to my alleged inattentiveness." Amaris's expression hardened, and she said, "You know what? I'm not going to stand here and be lectured by you about honesty and communication when you just publicly humiliated me in front of my entire family without even giving me a chance to explain or defend myself. You sent those screenshots to the group chat knowing exactly what kind of reaction it would provoke, and knowing that it would turn my own family against me. So don't pretend that you're taking some kind of moral high ground here, when what you really did was use my family as a weapon to punish me." I stood up from my desk chair and moved to the filing cabinet where I kept client documents, and I pulled out a blank folder and began organizing some papers that didn't really need organizing, mostly as a way to give myself something to do with my hands while I processed what Amaris had just said. And after a moment I responded, "You're right that I knew the screenshots would provoke a strong reaction from your family, and I knew that sharing them in the group chat would mean that you couldn't control the narrative or spin the situation to make yourself look better. But I don't see how that's fundamentally different from what you've been doing for the past 4 months, which is using our shared life and our shared home and our shared friends like Harper as props and alibis to facilitate your affair. So if you want to talk about using people as weapons, then perhaps we should start with the fact that you weaponized our marriage and my trust in order to maintain your secret relationship with Lucas." Amaris was quiet for a long moment, and I could see that she was breathing heavily and that tears were starting to form in her eyes. But I couldn't tell if the tears were genuine expressions of remorse and sadness or if they were tactical tears, designed to make me feel guilty and to manipulate me into backing down from my position. Finally, Amaris said, in a quieter voice, "What do you want from me, Rey? Do you want me to grovel and apologize? Do you want me to promise that I'll never see Lucas again? Do you want me to call my family and tell them that the screenshots were fake or misunderstood? Just tell me what you want, and I'll do it, because I can't handle this right now. I can't handle my mother calling me every 5 minutes and my sister sending me these horrible accusatory messages and knowing that my father is probably sitting at home thinking that he raised a daughter who's a liar and a cheater." I turned to face her directly and said, "What I want is for you to move out of this house, and I want you to do it within the next week so that we can begin the formal separation process. And I want you to understand that I've already contacted a divorce attorney and that I'll be filing papers as soon as they're prepared. And I want you to know that I have considerably more evidence than just the screenshots that Harper sent me, because I've been documenting inconsistencies in your schedule and expenses for the past 2 months, and I have credit card statements and metadata from our shared cloud storage and a timeline of your activities that corroborates everything that's in those screenshots." Amaris stared at me with an expression that combined shock and disbelief, and she said, "You've been investigating me for 2 months, and you didn't say anything?" And I responded, "I noticed some irregularities in our shared credit card statements about 2 months ago, charges at hotels and restaurants that didn't match up with the work events you had told me about, and I started paying more attention and documenting what I found, and yes, I could have confronted you at any point during that process, but I wanted to make sure I had complete and accurate information before making any decisions about how to proceed, because that's how I approach everything in my professional life, and I saw no reason to use a different standard in my personal life." Amaris shook her head slowly and said, "You're unbelievable. You know that? You've been sitting here in your garage playing detective and building a case against me like I'm some kind of criminal defendant instead of your wife. And now you're telling me that you want me to move out and that you're filing for divorce, and you're doing all of this without even giving me a chance to explain or to try to fix things or to show you that I'm genuinely sorry for hurting you." I moved back to my desk and sat down, and I pulled up a new document on my computer and began typing. And without looking at Amaris, I said, "I'm giving you 1 week to find alternative housing and to remove your personal belongings from this house. And during that week, I'll be staying at a hotel so that you can have space and privacy to pack without having to deal with my presence. And my attorney will be in touch with you or with your attorney if you choose to hire one to discuss the terms of the separation agreement and the division of assets." Amaris stood in the doorway of my garage office for another long moment, and I could see from my peripheral vision that she was struggling to decide whether to continue arguing or to accept that I was serious about ending the marriage and that no amount of pleading or explaining was going to change my position. Finally, she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you." And then she turned and walked back through the interior door into the house, and I heard her footsteps moving quickly up the stairs to our bedroom. And then I heard the bedroom door close with enough force that it was almost but not quite a slam. I sat at my desk and continued working on the title search documentation for another 30 minutes, more out of a need to maintain some sense of normalcy and routine than out of any real necessity to finish the work that night. And then I closed my laptop and began gathering the files and documents that I would need to take with me to a hotel for the next week. I had meant what I told Amaris about staying elsewhere while she packed and moved out, not because I was trying to be gracious or accommodating, but because I knew from my paralegal experience that separation situations could escalate quickly into confrontations or allegations of harassment if the parties continued living under the same roof after the relationship had effectively ended, and I wanted to create clear physical and temporal distance between us so that there could be no question later about who had done what or who had said what during this transition period. I pulled out my phone and opened a hotel booking application, and I searched for extended stay hotels in the area that offered weekly rates and that had availability starting tonight, and I found a reasonably priced option about 20 minutes away that offered a kitchenette and separate sleeping area, and I booked it for 7 nights with the understanding that I could extend the reservation if Amaris needed more time to find permanent housing. While I was packing a suitcase with clothes and toiletries, my phone began ringing with a call from a number that I recognized as belonging to Amaris's mother, Diane, and I briefly considered letting the call go to voicemail because I wasn't sure I had the emotional energy to deal with what would likely be either an angry confrontation or a tearful plea for me to reconsider my decision to end the marriage. But I also knew that Diane deserved to hear my side of the situation directly, rather than having to rely on whatever version of events Amaris might tell her. I answered the call and said, "Hello, Diane," and she responded immediately in a voice that was tight with controlled emotion. "Rey, I need you to explain to me what those screenshots mean, because I've been trying to reach Amaris for the past hour, and she's not answering my calls, and I need to understand if what I think I'm seeing in those messages is actually what's happening, or if there's some other explanation that I'm missing." I sat down on the edge of the bed in our bedroom and said, "The screenshots are exactly what they appear to be, which is evidence that Amaris has been having an affair with someone named Lucas, who works at her consulting firm, and the affair has been going on for at least 4 months based on the dates in those messages, and she's been using various cover stories about work events and late meetings to explain her absences, and she's been asking her friend Harper to provide false alibis when needed." Diane was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "And you're certain about this? You're certain that those messages are real and not somehow doctored or taken out of context?" And I responded, "I'm certain, and I also have additional evidence beyond the screenshots that Harper sent me, including credit card charges for hotels and restaurants that don't match Amaris's claimed schedule, and gaps in her gym attendance records even though she's been telling me she's going to the gym several evenings per week, and metadata from our shared cloud storage showing that she deleted a number of photos from dates that correspond with the affair timeline." Diane let out a long breath that sounded like she had been punched in the stomach, and she said, "I don't understand how this could have happened. I don't understand how she could do something like this. I raised her to be honest and to respect her commitments and to treat other people with integrity, and I just can't reconcile the daughter I know with someone who would lie so systematically and who would betray her husband in such a calculated way." I heard the pain in Diane's voice, and I felt a wave of sympathy for her, because I knew that discovering your child has been lying and cheating creates a particular kind of grief that's different from discovering that your spouse has betrayed you, because as a parent you can't help but feel some sense of responsibility for your child's moral character even when that child is a grown adult making their own choices. I said, "I know this is difficult for you, and I know you're probably feeling a mixture of emotions right now, including anger at Amaris, and maybe even some misplaced guilt about whether you could have done something differently in raising her. But I want you to know that I don't hold you or Robert responsible for Amaris's choices, and I don't expect you to choose sides or to cut her off or to do anything other than process this information in whatever way feels right to you." Diane was quiet for another moment, and then she said, "What are you going to do now? Are you going to try to work through this with counseling, or are you planning to end the marriage?" And I responded, "I've already told Amaris that I want her to move out within the next week, and that I'll be filing for divorce as soon as my attorney has the paperwork prepared, and I know that probably sounds harsh or precipitous, given that this just came to light tonight, but the truth is that I've suspected something was wrong for the past 2 months, and I've been documenting evidence during that time, so this isn't a snap decision based on one emotional moment. It's a decision based on a sustained pattern of deception that I don't believe can be repaired or overcome." Diane said, "I understand, and I want you to know that I support whatever decision you make. And I'm not going to pressure you to give her another chance or to try to salvage the marriage if you feel that trust has been broken beyond repair. But I do want to ask you one thing, which is whether you would be willing to meet with me tomorrow morning so that we can talk face to face, and so that I can hear more details about what you've discovered and what your timeline looks like for the separation process." I agreed to meet Diane the following morning at a coffee shop that was roughly halfway between her house and the hotel where I would be staying, and after we ended the call, I finished packing my suitcase and gathered my laptop and the files that I would need for work, and I walked through the house one last time to make sure I had everything I needed and to take a mental inventory of our shared possessions and how they would eventually need to be divided as part of the divorce settlement. I could hear Amaris moving around upstairs in the bedroom, and I could hear what sounded like her talking on the phone in a low, urgent voice, probably to Lucas, or possibly to Harper, or one of her other friends, and I felt a brief temptation to go upstairs and listen to what she was saying, but I resisted that temptation because I knew that eavesdropping would only lead to another confrontation and would give Amaris an opportunity to accuse me of spying or violating her privacy, which would muddy the moral clarity of the situation and make it easier for her to claim that we were both at fault. I left the house through the garage door and loaded my suitcase and work materials into my car. And as I backed out of the driveway, I saw the bedroom light turn off upstairs, which meant that Amaris was probably done with her phone call and was either going to sleep or was sitting in the dark processing everything that had happened tonight. I drove to the extended stay hotel and checked in at the front desk, and the night clerk barely glanced at my identification before handing me a key card and giving me perfunctory directions to my room on the second floor, and I was grateful for his lack of curiosity or small talk, because I didn't have the energy to maintain a pleasant facade or to pretend that this was a normal business trip or vacation stay. The room was clean and functional, if somewhat depressing, with beige walls and generic landscape prints and furniture that looked like it had been selected for durability rather than comfort. But it had a desk where I could work and a decent internet connection and enough space for me to establish a temporary routine while I figured out what came next. I unpacked my suitcase and set up my laptop at the desk, and then I opened my email and drafted a message to my divorce attorney, a man named Richard Chen, whom I had worked with briefly during my paralegal days and who had a reputation for being thorough and strategic without being needlessly aggressive or combative. In the email, I explained that I needed to retain his services for a divorce filing, and I provided a brief summary of the situation, including the affair evidence and the timeline, and I asked him to call me at his earliest convenience to discuss next steps and to review the documentation I had compiled. After sending the email, I opened a new document and began creating a detailed chronological timeline of every piece of evidence I had collected over the past 2 months, including the dates and amounts of suspicious credit card charges. The dates when Amaris had claimed to be attending work events that I later discovered hadn't actually happened, the dates when she had claimed to be at the gym but hadn't checked in according to the membership portal, and the dates of the deleted photos from our shared cloud storage that corresponded with affair-related activities. As I worked on this timeline, I felt a strange sense of calm and focus that was similar to what I experienced when working on complex title searches or property disputes, because the process of organizing information chronologically and identifying patterns and inconsistencies was deeply familiar to me and gave me a sense of control and purpose that helped to counteract the emotional chaos of the situation. By the time I finished the timeline document, it was almost 2 a.m, and I had created a comprehensive record that spanned 4 months and included more than 30 separate pieces of evidence, each one documented with dates and sources and cross-references to other pieces of evidence that provided corroboration or additional context. I saved the document in multiple locations, including my laptop's hard drive, a cloud storage service, and a USB drive that I kept in my wallet, because I had learned from my paralegal work that the most important documents in any legal proceeding were the ones that could be easily lost or accidentally deleted, and that maintaining multiple backup copies was essential to ensuring that evidence remained available when it was needed. I finally allowed myself to lie down on the hotel bed fully clothed, and I stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 4 hours. From the moment I had received Harper's screenshots to the confrontation with Amaris in the garage to the phone call with Diane to the creation of the comprehensive evidence timeline. I felt emotionally exhausted, but physically restless, as if my body hadn't caught up with the fact that the immediate crisis was over and that I was now in a waiting period where the next moves would be determined by attorneys and logistics rather than by dramatic confrontations or emotional revelations. I slept fitfully for a few hours and woke up around 6:30 in the morning with the disorienting feeling that comes from being in an unfamiliar room and not immediately remembering why you're there, and then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and I felt the same cold knot of anger and betrayal in my stomach that I had felt when I first saw Harper's screenshots. I showered and dressed in the clothes I had packed, and I made coffee using the small single-serve machine that the hotel provided, and I sat at the desk and reviewed the timeline document I had created the night before, making a few small additions and corrections as I remembered additional details or noticed inconsistencies that needed to be resolved. Around 7:30, I received a response email from Richard Chen saying that he had reviewed my initial message and that he could meet with me later that afternoon to discuss the case in detail and to begin preparing the necessary divorce filings. And he asked me to bring any documentation I had compiled along with a list of shared assets and liabilities so that we could begin the process of inventorying what would need to be divided as part of the settlement. I spent the next hour creating a comprehensive asset inventory using a spreadsheet that listed everything from major items like the house and our cars to smaller items like furniture and electronics and kitchen appliances. And next to each item I noted whether it had been purchased before the marriage, during the marriage, or whether it had been a gift from family members, because I knew that the origin and timing of asset acquisition would be relevant to determining how things should be divided under the state's marital property laws. The house was by far the most significant asset, with an estimated current value of around $400,000 and an outstanding mortgage balance of approximately $250,000, which meant there was roughly $150,000 in equity that would need to be split, or that one party could potentially buy out from the other. I had been the one to make the down payment on the house using savings from my paralegal career, but we had both been making the monthly mortgage payments from our joint account for the past 4 years, which meant that the equity situation was going to be complicated and would probably require some negotiation or potentially even a court determination if we couldn't reach an agreement. At 8 o'clock, I left the hotel and drove to the coffee shop where I had agreed to meet Diane, and I arrived a few minutes early and ordered a black coffee and found a table in the back corner where we could talk with some degree of privacy without being overheard by other customers. Diane arrived right on time, looking tired and older than I remembered from the last time I had seen her, which had been at a family dinner about 3 weeks ago, where Amaris had been cheerful and attentive and had given no indication whatsoever that she was maintaining a secret relationship with someone from her office. Diane ordered a tea from the counter and then joined me at the table, and we sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before she said, "I didn't sleep at all last night. I kept going over every conversation I've had with Amaris over the past few months, trying to figure out if there were signs I missed or if she said things that should have tipped me off to what was happening, and I keep coming back to the fact that she seemed completely normal and happy, and I had no idea that anything was wrong. I nodded and said, I had the same experience. There were small things that seemed slightly off when I look back at them with the benefit of hindsight, like the fact that she was working late more frequently than usual, or that she seemed more protective of her phone and would take it with her into the bathroom or keep it face down on the table when we were having dinner, but none of those things by themselves were dramatic enough to make me suspicious. And I think that's part of how affairs work. They rely on the fact that most people don't want to believe that their spouse or their child is capable of sustained deception, so we rationalize away the small warning signs until we're confronted with evidence that's impossible to ignore. Diane wrapped both hands around her teacup as if she was trying to warm herself, even though the coffee shop was perfectly comfortable, and she said, Amaris called me around midnight last night after you left the house, and she was almost hysterical, crying, and saying that you had completely misunderstood the situation, and that the screenshots Harper sent you were taken out of context, and that her relationship with Lucas was just a close friendship that I was misinterpreting as something more serious. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I had saved the screenshots from Harper, and I slid the phone across the table to Diane and said, I want you to read through these again carefully and tell me if you think there's any reasonable interpretation of these messages that would support Amaris's claim that this was just a friendship being misunderstood. And Diane picked up the phone and scrolled through the 4 screenshots slowly, reading each message multiple times, and when she finished, she set the phone down and shook her head and said, No, there's no ambiguity here. These messages clearly describe a romantic and sexual relationship that was being deliberately hidden from you, and the references to booking hotels and coordinating alibis and coming over to your house while you were working make it absolutely clear that this wasn't innocent or platonic. I retrieved my phone and said, I appreciate you being willing to look at this objectively rather than automatically taking Amaris's side or assuming that I must have done something to drive her into someone else's arms, because I know it must be incredibly difficult to accept that your daughter has been lying to you and to me and to everyone else in her life. Diane took a sip of her tea and said, I'm not going to defend what she did or try to minimize it or make excuses for her, but I do want to understand what happened and why it happened, because the Amaris I know has always been honest and straightforward, even when the truth was uncomfortable or difficult, so the fact that she engaged in this kind of systematic deception feels completely out of character and makes me wonder if there were other things going on in her life or in your marriage that might have contributed to her making such terrible choices. I felt a flash of annoyance at this attempt to identify contributing factors or mitigating circumstances, because it sounded like the beginning of an argument that would ultimately conclude that while Amaris's affair was wrong, I bore some responsibility for creating conditions that made the affair more likely, but I also recognized that Diane was a mother trying to make sense of her daughter's behavior, and that she wasn't necessarily trying to blame me or to absolve Amaris of responsibility. I said carefully, I've thought a lot about that question over the past 2 months while I was noticing irregularities and starting to suspect that something was wrong, and I've tried to be honest with myself about whether there were problems in our marriage that I was ignoring or ways that I was failing to meet Amaris's emotional needs, and I can acknowledge that I'm someone who tends to be work-focused and who doesn't naturally seek out social interaction or romantic gestures, and I can imagine that Amaris might have felt that I was taking her for granted or not paying enough attention to our relationship. Diane leaned forward slightly and said, and I continued, but even if I accept that there were problems in our marriage that needed to be addressed, the appropriate response to those problems would have been for Amaris to talk to me about her concerns, to suggest that we needed to work on our relationship or consider counseling, or in the worst case, to tell me that she wanted a separation so that she could pursue other relationships. But what she chose to do instead was to maintain the appearance of a normal marriage while simultaneously conducting a secret affair. And that choice represents a fundamental betrayal of trust that I don't believe can be repaired regardless of whatever problems might have existed beforehand. Diane nodded slowly and said, I understand your position, and I can't say that I disagree with it, and I want you to know that Robert and I are not going to pressure you to reconsider or to give Amaris another chance if you've decided that the marriage is over, but I do hope that you'll be willing to handle the divorce process in a way that's fair and reasonable and doesn't turn into one of those bitter, contentious divorces where both parties are trying to hurt each other and using lawyers to fight over every piece of furniture and every shared photograph. I said, that's exactly what I'm trying to avoid, which is why I'm staying in a hotel for the next week to give Amaris space to move out without us having to be in the same house, and why I'm working with an attorney who has a reputation for being thorough but not needlessly aggressive, and why I documented all of the evidence carefully so that there wouldn't be any ambiguity or room for Amaris to claim that I was making false accusations or trying to damage her reputation without justification. I pulled out my laptop and opened the timeline document I had created the night before, and I showed Diane the chronological record of evidence that I had compiled, including the credit card charges and the gym attendance gaps and the cloud storage metadata. And as she read through the document, her expression shifted from sad resignation to something that looked more like anger or disappointment. When she finished reading, she said, "This is very thorough and very damning, and it shows a level of planning and coordination that makes it clear this wasn't just a moment of weakness or a one-time mistake. This was a sustained deception that involved creating elaborate cover stories and recruiting other people like Harper to provide alibis. And I have to say that I'm not just disappointed in Amaris for having the affair. I'm almost more disappointed in the fact that she was willing to be so calculating and manipulative in hiding it." I closed the laptop and said, "That's exactly how I feel, and that's why I don't think counseling or reconciliation would be productive. Because even if Amaris ended the affair and apologized and promised to be faithful going forward, I would never be able to trust her again. I would always be wondering if she was telling me the truth about where she was going or who she was with. And I would always be looking for evidence of deception, and that's not a foundation for a healthy marriage." Diane reached across the table and put her hand on mine for a moment, and she said, "I'm so sorry that she did this to you, and I'm sorry that you're having to go through this process, and I want you to know that Robert and I still consider you part of our family regardless of what happens with the divorce, and we hope that you'll stay in touch with us and let us know if there's anything we can do to support you during this transition." I felt a wave of emotion at Diane's words, and I had to blink back tears because I realized that I had been bracing myself for Amaris's family to close ranks around her and to treat me as the enemy or the outsider who was trying to hurt their daughter. And the fact that Diane was instead offering support and understanding and continued relationship was something I hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to process. I thanked Diane and told her that I would definitely stay in touch. And then I asked her if she had any sense of what Amaris's plans were in terms of finding a new place to live and whether she would be moving in with Lucas or finding her own apartment or potentially moving back in with her parents temporarily. Diane shook her head and said, "She hasn't told us anything about her plans, and honestly, I'm not sure that I want her to move back in with us right now because I think she needs to face the consequences of her choices rather than running back to her childhood bedroom where Robert and I would inevitably end up taking care of her and shielding her from having to deal with the practical and emotional fallout of what she's done." I left the coffee shop after talking with Diane for almost 2 hours, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Amaris's family was not going to automatically defend her behavior or try to pressure me into reconciliation, but sadness that our marriage had deteriorated to the point where I was having these kinds of conversations with my mother-in-law about evidence timelines and divorce logistics instead of planning holiday gatherings or discussing vacation destinations. I drove back to the hotel and spent the rest of the morning working on client files and responding to emails from my broker about upcoming property closings, and I found that immersing myself in the familiar routines of title searches and contract reviews helped to create a sense of normalcy and purpose that counteracted the emotional turbulence of everything else that was happening in my life. Around noon, I received a text message from Harper asking if I was okay and saying that she felt terrible about the role she had played in enabling Amaris's affair by providing alibis, and she said that she wanted to meet with me to apologize in person and to tell me more about what she knew regarding the timeline and details of Amaris's relationship with Lucas. I was initially hesitant to meet with Harper because I wasn't sure whether her sudden attack of conscience was genuine or whether she was trying to position herself as a helpful ally in order to assuage her own guilt, but I also recognized that Harper might have information that would be useful in establishing the full scope and duration of the affair, and that having a witness who could corroborate the timeline and provide additional details would strengthen my position if Amaris decided to contest the divorce or to make claims about my behavior that would require me to defend myself. I texted Harper back and suggested that we meet at a different coffee shop later that afternoon, and she agreed immediately and said that she would bring some additional information that she thought I should see. I spent the early afternoon preparing for my meeting with Richard Chen by organizing all of my documentation into clearly labeled folders, both physical folders with printed copies of key evidence and digital folders with scanned documents and screenshots. And I created a summary document that outlined the key facts of the case and the timeline of events and the evidence that supported each claim. At 2 o'clock, I drove to Richard Chen's law office, which was located in a modern glass and steel building in the downtown business district, and I took the elevator to the 7th floor where his firm occupied a suite of offices with views overlooking the city. Richard's assistant showed me into a conference room and offered me coffee or water, and a few minutes later Richard entered the room carrying a legal pad and looking exactly as I remembered him from our brief professional interaction years ago. a man in his early 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm, analytical demeanor that inspired confidence without being arrogant or off-putting. We shook hands, and Richard said, "I read through the summary you sent me last night, and I have to say that you've done an exceptionally thorough job of documenting the affair and creating a timeline that will be very difficult for your wife to dispute or explain away, and based on what you've shown me, I think we have a very strong case for filing for divorce on grounds of adultery, which in this state can affect the division of assets and potentially eliminate any claim your wife might make for spousal support." I opened my laptop and walked Richard through the complete evidence file, showing him the screenshots from Harper, the credit card statements with highlighted charges, the gym attendance records, the cloud storage metadata, and the comprehensive timeline that cross-referenced all of these different sources of information. Richard took detailed notes as I explained each piece of evidence and how it connected to the others, and he occasionally asked clarifying questions about dates or amounts or about how I had obtained certain information, and I could tell that he was mentally constructing the legal arguments and strategies that would form the basis of our divorce filing. When I finished presenting the evidence, Richard leaned back in his chair and said, "This is one of the most well-documented cases of marital infidelity that I've seen in my 25 years of practicing family law, and I think we're in an excellent position to file for divorce and to negotiate a settlement that protects your interests and ensures that you're not penalized financially for your wife's decision to engage in an extramarital affair." Richard explained that under the state's divorce laws, we would need to file a petition for dissolution of marriage that outlined the grounds for divorce and the proposed division of assets and liabilities, and that Amaris would then have 30 days to file a response either accepting the proposed terms or contesting them and proposing alternative terms. He said that in his experience, most divorce cases were ultimately resolved through negotiation and settlement rather than through contested court hearings, because going to trial was expensive and time-consuming and unpredictable, and because most people preferred to maintain some degree of control over the outcome rather than leaving the decision entirely in the hands of a judge who might not rule the way either party expected. Richard asked me what my priorities were in terms of the asset division, and I told him that my primary concern was keeping the house, which I had purchased with my own savings and which I had been maintaining and improving throughout our marriage, and that I was willing to negotiate on most other assets as long as the overall division was fair and reflected the fact that Amaris's affair had been the cause of the marriage breakdown. Richard made notes about my priorities and then said, "I think we have a strong argument for you to retain the house, especially given that you made the down payment and that you've been the primary person responsible for maintenance and improvements, and I think we can also make a compelling case that Amaris should not receive spousal support given that she was employed throughout the marriage and that her affair demonstrates a lack of good faith in the marital relationship." We spent another hour discussing the details of the divorce filing and the timeline for the process, and Richard explained that he would draft the initial petition and have it ready for my review within the next few days, and that once I approved the language, we would file it with the court and arrange for Amaris to be served with the papers, which could be done either through certified mail or through a professional process server, depending on whether we thought Amaris would accept service voluntarily or whether we needed to document the service more formally. After leaving Richard's office, I drove to the coffee shop where I had agreed to meet Harper, and I arrived a few minutes early and ordered another black coffee, even though I had already consumed more caffeine than was probably healthy, and I sat at a table near the window and watched the street outside while I waited for Harper to arrive. She showed up about 10 minutes later looking nervous and apologetic, and she sat down across from me and immediately launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about how sorry she was for not telling me sooner about Amaris's affair and how guilty she felt about providing alibis and cover stories that had enabled Amaris to continue deceiving me. I listened to Harper's apology without interrupting, and when she finished, I said, "I appreciate you telling me about the affair and sending me those screenshots, because without that information, I might have continued documenting evidence for weeks or months before confronting Amaris, and I think it's better that everything came to light when it did, rather than dragging on indefinitely." Harper looked relieved that I wasn't angry with her, and she pulled out her phone and said, "I wanted to show you some additional messages that I didn't include in the screenshots I sent you last night, because I wasn't sure how much detail you wanted to see, but after thinking about it, I realized that you deserved to know the full extent of what was happening and how long it had been going on." She handed me her phone, and I scrolled through a series of text message conversations between Harper and Amaris that dated back almost 6 months, and what I saw confirmed that the affair had been going on significantly longer than the 4 months I had estimated based on the credit card charges and other evidence I had compiled. The earliest messages showed Amaris telling Harper about meeting someone new at work who was really interesting and attractive, and Harper responding with encouraging messages about how Amaris deserved to be happy and how it was okay to have a crush as long as she didn't act on it, and then subsequent messages showing Amaris gradually revealing more details about her interactions with Lucas and eventually admitting that they had started spending time together outside of work. What struck me most about these messages was the way that Harper's responses had evolved from initial encouragement to growing concern, and eventually to explicit warnings that Amaris was making a mistake and needed to either end the affair or be honest with me about what was happening. And I could see that Harper had genuinely struggled with the ethical dilemma of whether to tell me about the affair or to respect Amaris's confidence and hope that she would eventually do the right thing on her own. I handed the phone back to Harper and said, "These messages show that the affair started at least 6 months ago, which is longer than I had estimated based on the financial evidence I compiled, and they also show that you tried multiple times to convince Amaris to end the relationship or to be honest with me, so I don't hold you responsible for what happened even though you did provide alibis that helped Amaris hide the affair." Harper looked like she might start crying, and she said, "I kept telling myself that it wasn't my place to get involved in someone else's marriage and that Amaris was an adult who could make her own decisions, but I also knew that what she was doing was wrong and that you deserved to know the truth. And I finally reached a point where I couldn't live with myself anymore if I continued to stay silent." I asked Harper if she would be willing to provide a written statement describing what she knew about the affair and the timeline and the alibis she had provided, because I thought that having a corroborating witness who could testify to these facts would be valuable if the divorce became contested or if Amaris tried to claim that I was exaggerating or fabricating evidence. Harper agreed immediately and said that she would write out everything she remembered and send it to me within the next day or two, and she also offered to speak with my attorney directly if that would be helpful. I thanked Harper for her willingness to cooperate and for finally deciding to tell me the truth, and I told her that I understood the difficult position she had been in and that I didn't blame her for initially trying to stay out of the situation. We talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, including the fact that Amaris had apparently been calling and texting Harper repeatedly since the previous night, demanding to know why Harper had betrayed her and accusing Harper of being jealous and vindictive, and Harper said that she had decided to block Amaris's number because she couldn't handle the constant barrage of angry and manipulative messages. After leaving the coffee shop, I returned to the hotel and spent the evening working on a detailed inventory of personal property that would need to be divided as part of the divorce settlement, and I went through old photos and receipts trying to remember which items had been purchased before the marriage, which had been wedding gifts, and which had been acquired jointly during the marriage. The process was tedious and emotionally draining because every item carried memories of our life together, from the couch we had picked out together during our first year of marriage to the kitchen appliances we had received as wedding gifts to the artwork we had collected during various vacations and trips. I found myself wondering what Amaris was doing at that moment, whether she was packing her belongings and looking for a new apartment, or whether she was still in denial about the seriousness of the situation and hoping that I would change my mind and agree to work on the marriage. And I felt a complicated mixture of anger at her betrayal and sadness at the loss of what I had thought was a stable and loving partnership. Around 9 o'clock that evening, I received an email from Richard Chen with a draft of the divorce petition attached, and I spent the next hour reviewing the document carefully and making notes about sections that needed clarification or revision. The petition was written in formal legal language that made our marriage and its dissolution sound clinical and impersonal, with phrases like irreconcilable differences and irretrievable breakdown of the marital relationship that seemed inadequate to describe the actual emotional reality of discovering that your spouse had been systematically lying to you for months. The divorce petition included a detailed accounting of our shared assets and liabilities, with the house listed as the primary marital asset along with our 2 cars, our retirement accounts, and various smaller items like furniture and electronics, and the petition proposed that I would retain the house in exchange for buying out Amaris's share of the equity, using funds from my retirement account, which would avoid the need to sell the property and split the proceeds. Richard had also included a section requesting that Amaris be denied any claim to spousal support based on her adultery and her own employment income, which was substantial enough that she could reasonably support herself without any financial contribution from me. And he had documented the affair using carefully worded language that referenced the existence of electronic communications and financial records that demonstrated an extramarital relationship without going into salacious details that might be inappropriate for a legal filing. I made a few minor edits to the petition to correct some dates and to clarify the ownership history of certain assets, and then I sent the revised version back to Richard with a note saying that I approved the document and that he should proceed with filing it with the court as soon as possible. I felt a strange sense of finality as I sent that email, because I knew that once the petition was filed and Amaris was served with the papers, there would be no going back and no opportunity to reconsider or to try to repair the marriage. And even though I was absolutely certain that divorce was the right decision, there was still something momentous and irreversible about taking this formal legal step that would officially end a relationship that had lasted 7 years. I tried to sleep that night, but found myself lying awake in the unfamiliar hotel bed, thinking about the timeline of our relationship, from our first meeting at a mutual friends party to our wedding 5 years ago, to the gradual accumulation of shared experiences and possessions and routines that had created the illusion of a stable life together. And I wondered at what point Amaris had decided that she was willing to risk everything we had built in order to pursue a relationship with Lucas. The next morning, I woke up early and checked my phone to find a text message from Amaris asking if we could meet to talk before I filed for divorce. And she said that she wanted a chance to explain her side of things and to discuss whether there might be any possibility of working through our problems rather than immediately ending the marriage. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide how to respond, and part of me was curious to hear what explanation or justification Amaris might offer for her behavior. But another part of me recognized that agreeing to meet with her would only delay the inevitable and would give her an opportunity to try to manipulate me emotionally or to plant seeds of doubt about whether I was making the right decision. I finally typed out a response that said, "I don't think a meeting would be productive at this point because I've already made my decision about ending the marriage and I've already retained an attorney who is preparing the divorce filing. And I think it's better for both of us if we communicate through our attorneys going forward rather than trying to have direct conversations that are likely to be emotional and unproductive." Amaris responded almost immediately with a longer message that said, "I understand that you're hurt and angry and that you feel betrayed, and I'm not asking you to forgive me or to pretend that what I did was okay, but I am asking you to at least hear me out and to let me explain how this happened and why I made the choices I made. Because I think you deserve to understand the full context rather than just seeing the evidence that makes me look like a terrible person who deliberately set out to hurt you." I read this message several times, and I felt my resolve weakening slightly, because there was a part of me that did want to understand how and why the affair had happened, and whether there had been warning signs or problems in our marriage that I had failed to recognize or address, but I also knew from my paralegal experience that people who are caught in wrongdoing often try to use explanation and context as a way of minimizing their responsibility, or shifting blame to external factors or to the person they've wronged. I decided to compromise by agreeing to meet with Amaris one time to hear what she had to say. But I made it clear in my response that this meeting would not change my decision to file for divorce, and that I would not be discussing the terms of the settlement or negotiating about asset division, because those were matters that would be handled by our respective attorneys. Amaris agreed to these conditions, and we arranged to meet that evening at a neutral location, a park near our house that had walking paths and benches, where we could talk semi-privately without being completely isolated or enclosed. I spent the rest of the day working on client files and trying not to think too much about the upcoming meeting, and I reminded myself repeatedly that I needed to stay calm and analytical and resist any attempts by Amaris to manipulate my emotions or to make me feel guilty for ending the marriage. I arrived at the park around 6 o'clock and found Amaris already sitting on a bench near the main walking path, and as I approached I could see that she looked exhausted and had clearly been crying, with red-rimmed eyes and smudged makeup that she hadn't bothered to fix. I sat down on the bench, maintaining a careful distance between us, and I waited for Amaris to speak first because I didn't want to set the tone of the conversation or to give her any opening to claim that I had been aggressive or confrontational. Amaris took a deep breath and said, "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know you didn't have to, and I know that you're probably dreading this conversation as much as I am, but I wanted a chance to explain what happened and to tell you that I never intended for any of this to hurt you the way it obviously has." I kept my expression neutral and said, "I'm here to listen, so if you have something you want to say, then I suggest you say it, but I want to be clear that nothing you tell me is going to change my decision to end the marriage or to file for divorce." Amaris nodded and said, "I understand that, and I'm not asking you to change your mind. I just want you to know the truth about how this started and why it continued, because I think you have a right to understand rather than just assuming that I'm some kind of heartless person who deliberately set out to deceive you and destroy our marriage." She paused for a moment as if gathering her thoughts, and then she continued. "The affair with Lucas started about 6 months ago at a work conference where we were both presenting on a project we had been collaborating on, and we ended up having dinner together after the presentations and talking for hours about our lives and our careers and our frustrations, and I told him things about our marriage that I had never told anyone else, including the fact that I felt like you were more interested in your property records and your title searches than you were in spending time with me or investing energy in our relationship. I felt a flash of anger at this characterization of our marriage, but I forced myself to stay quiet and let Amaris continue talking without interrupting or defending myself. Amaris went on. "Lucas was sympathetic and understanding in a way that I hadn't experienced in a long time, and he made me feel valued and interesting and attractive, And when he suggested that we get together again outside of work, I told myself that it was just a friendship and that there was nothing wrong with having a male friend who I could talk to about things that I couldn't discuss with you. She paused again and wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, and then she said, "But obviously it didn't stay just a friendship. And after a few weeks of meeting for coffee and lunch, we started having more intimate conversations, and eventually we kissed. And after that first kiss, I knew that I had crossed a line and that I should either end things with Lucas or be honest with you about what was happening. But I didn't do either of those things because I was scared and confused, and I didn't want to lose what I had with Lucas, but I also didn't want to blow up our marriage and have to deal with all the consequences." I finally spoke and said, "So instead of making a difficult choice and dealing with the consequences like an adult, you decided to try to have both relationships simultaneously and to lie to me repeatedly about where you were and what you were doing, and you recruited Harper to help you maintain your cover stories, and you used our home as a meeting place for your affair while I was working in the garage just a few yards away, and you did all of this for 6 months while maintaining the appearance of a normal marriage." Amaris flinched at the harsh summary, but she didn't deny any of it, and she said, "I know that what I did was wrong, and I know that there's no excuse for the lying and the deception, and I'm not trying to minimize my responsibility or to claim that you somehow drove me into Lucas's arms, but I do want you to understand that I wasn't just having an affair for the thrill of it, or because I wanted to hurt you. I was trying to fill an emotional void that I felt in our marriage, and I made terrible choices about how to do that." I stood up from the bench because I could feel my anger rising, and I didn't want to say something in the heat of the moment that I would later regret. And I said, "I've heard what you wanted to tell me, and I appreciate that you acknowledged your responsibility for what happened, but I don't accept the premise that there was an emotional void in our marriage that justified or explained your decision to have an affair. Because if you were unhappy or feeling neglected, then you had multiple other options available to you that didn't involve lying and cheating and betraying my trust for 6 months." Amaris stood up as well and took a step toward me, and she said, "I'm not asking you to accept my explanation as a justification. I'm just trying to help you understand that this wasn't a calculated plan to destroy our marriage. It was a series of bad decisions that snowballed into something much bigger and more damaging than I ever intended." I took a step back to maintain the distance between us and said, "The problem with that explanation is that affairs don't just happen accidentally. They require sustained effort and planning and coordination. And the evidence I've compiled shows that you were very deliberate about creating alibis and cover stories and making sure that I wouldn't discover what was going on. So this wasn't just a series of impulsive mistakes. This was a systematic deception that you maintained over a long period of time." Amaris's expression shifted from apologetic to defensive, and she said, "Fine. If you want to reduce everything to a legal case and treat me like a defendant being cross-examined, then go ahead. But don't pretend that you're completely blameless in all of this. Because the truth is that our marriage had problems long before I met Lucas, and if you had been paying more attention to our relationship instead of being buried in your work all the time, then maybe I wouldn't have been vulnerable to someone else's attention and affection." I felt my jaw clench at this attempt to shift blame back onto me, and I said, "We're done here. I agreed to meet with you and to listen to what you had to say, and I've done that. But I'm not going to stand here and be told that I'm somehow responsible for your decision to have an affair because I worked long hours or because I didn't provide enough attention or emotional support, because that's a manipulative argument that attempts to make me feel guilty for your choices." I turned and started walking back toward the parking lot, and Amaris called after me, "Ray, wait. I didn't mean it like that. I'm not trying to blame you. I'm just trying to explain the context." But I didn't stop or turn around, and I kept walking until I reached my car and drove back to the hotel feeling emotionally drained and more certain than ever that I had made the right decision in ending the marriage. When I returned to the hotel after my meeting with Amaris in the park, I felt a strange sense of clarity and resolve that I hadn't experienced before, because hearing her attempt to justify the affair by blaming the emotional state of our marriage had actually reinforced my conviction that divorce was the only reasonable path forward, and that any attempt at reconciliation would simply lead to more cycles of blame and resentment and manipulation. I spent the evening reviewing the written statement that Harper had sent me earlier that day, which was a detailed 3-page document describing everything she knew about the affair, including specific dates when Amaris had asked her to provide alibis, conversations where Amaris had talked about her feelings for Lucas, and Harper's own internal struggle about whether to remain silent or to tell me what was happening. Harper's statement was remarkably thorough and included details that corroborated my own evidence timeline, such as the fact that Amaris had told Harper she was planning a weekend getaway with Lucas in early April, which matched exactly with the hotel charges I had found on our credit card statement from that time period. The following morning, I received a call from Richard Chen informing me that he had filed the divorce petition with the court, and that the next step was to arrange for Amaris to be formally served with the papers, and he asked whether I thought Amaris would accept service voluntarily if we sent the documents via certified mail, or whether we should use a professional process server to ensure that the service was properly documented. I told Richard that I wasn't sure how Amaris would respond, but that I thought it would be safer to use a process server to avoid any possibility of her claiming that she never received the documents or that the service was improper, and Richard agreed and said he would arrange for a process server to deliver the papers to Amaris at our house within the next day or two. I spent the rest of the morning working on client files and trying to maintain some semblance of normal professional routine, and around noon I received a text message from Diane asking if I would be willing to meet with her and Rebecca, Amaris's younger sister, because Rebecca had some information that she wanted to share with me and that she thought would be relevant to the divorce proceedings. I was initially hesitant because I wasn't sure what Rebecca could possibly tell me that would be more significant than the evidence I had already compiled, but I also trusted Diane's judgment and knew that she wouldn't be arranging this meeting unless she thought it was genuinely important. I agreed to meet them that afternoon at Diane's house, and when I arrived, I found both Diane and Rebecca sitting in the living room looking serious and uncomfortable, and Rebecca was holding her phone in her hands and kept glancing down at it, as if she was nervous about what she was going to show me. Diane gestured for me to sit down and said, "Rebecca has something she needs to tell you, and I want you to know that she's been struggling with whether to come forward with this information because it involves a private conversation she had with Amaris. But after thinking about it and talking with me, she decided that you deserve to know the truth about what Amaris has been planning." Rebecca took a deep breath and said, "About 2 weeks ago, before any of this came out into the open, Amaris called me and asked if I would meet her for lunch because she wanted to talk to me about something serious. And when we met, she told me that she was thinking about divorcing you, but that she was worried about how it would look to the family and to her friends if people knew that she was the one who wanted to end the marriage." I felt my stomach tighten as Rebecca continued speaking, because I could sense that whatever she was about to reveal was going to be significant and probably disturbing. Rebecca went on. "Amaris asked me if I thought the family would be more supportive of her decision to divorce if there was some kind of justification that made it seem like you were at fault rather than her. And I told her that I didn't think she should be thinking about how to manipulate people's perceptions, and that if she wanted a divorce, she should just be honest about her reasons. But then she said something that really shocked me." Rebecca looked down at her phone and then back up at me, and she said, "Amaris told me that she had been reading online about how women in divorce cases sometimes claim that their husbands were emotionally or psychologically abusive as a way of gaining sympathy and ensuring favorable treatment in terms of asset division and custody arrangements, and she asked me what I thought about that strategy and whether I thought people would believe her if she made those kinds of claims about you." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach, and I had to consciously remind myself to keep breathing and to stay calm, even though I was feeling a combination of shock and rage at the revelation that Amaris had been contemplating making false abuse allegations against me as part of a divorce strategy. Diane reached over and put her hand on my arm, and she said, "I want you to know that Rebecca immediately told Amaris that making false accusations would be completely wrong and potentially illegal, and that she wouldn't support Amaris or help her in any way if she tried to go down that path." Rebecca nodded and said, "I told her that I thought it was despicable to even consider making false abuse claims, and that doing something like that would not only hurt you, but would also hurt all the women who have actually experienced abuse and who need to be believed and supported, and I told her that if she went through with a plan like that, I would tell you and the family exactly what she had said to me." Rebecca held up her phone and said, "But here's the thing that I didn't tell Amaris. When she was talking about this during lunch, I was recording our conversation on my phone, because something about the way she was talking made me feel like I needed to have documentation of what she was saying in case she actually followed through with making false accusations. And I want you to have this recording so that you can protect yourself if Amaris tries to claim that you were abusive or controlling or anything else that isn't true." Rebecca handed me her phone and showed me how to play the audio file, and I listened to about 10 minutes of the conversation between her and Amaris, and what I heard made me feel physically ill because Amaris's voice on the recording was calm and calculating as she discussed the possibility of claiming emotional abuse, and she talked about how she could frame my work habits and my preference for quiet evenings at home as evidence of controlling behavior, and how she could characterize my detailed documentation of our finances as obsessive and manipulative rather than simply responsible financial management. At one point in the recording, Amaris said, "The key is to mix in just enough truth with the exaggerations so that it sounds believable, like I could talk about how he tracks every dollar we spend and how he gets upset if I don't account for where I've been, and people will naturally interpret that as controlling behavior even though the reality is more complicated." And hearing her strategize about how to twist normal marital behaviors into evidence of abuse made me realize that I had been living with someone whose capacity for manipulation and deception was far more extensive than I had previously understood. I handed the phone back to Rebecca and said, "Thank you for recording this and for being willing to share it with me, because if Amaris had actually gone through with making false abuse allegations as part of the divorce, this recording would be crucial evidence to refute those claims and to demonstrate that she had been planning to lie in order to gain advantage in the settlement." Rebecca looked relieved that I wasn't angry with her for recording her sister without permission, and she said, "I felt terrible about recording Amaris without telling her, because normally I would never do something like that. But I also felt like the potential harm of letting her make false accusations without any way to prove they were lies was much worse than the ethical problem of secretly recording a conversation." Diane added, "Rebecca came to me immediately after that lunch and told me what Amaris had said, and we've been discussing for the past 2 weeks whether to tell you about it, and we finally decided that we had to say something once the affair came to light, and we realized that Amaris was capable of much more deception than we had previously believed." I asked Rebecca if she would be willing to provide a copy of the recording to my attorney and to potentially testify about the conversation if it became necessary during the divorce proceedings, and she agreed without hesitation and said that she would do whatever was needed to make sure the truth came out, and that Amaris couldn't use false accusations as a weapon against me. I spent another hour at Diane's house discussing the implications of Rebecca's recording and what it revealed about Amaris's character and her willingness to use any available tactic to protect herself and to avoid taking responsibility for her own choices. And Diane told me that both she and Robert were absolutely horrified by what Rebecca had recorded, and that they fully supported whatever legal actions I needed to take to protect myself from Amaris's potential false allegations. When I left Diane's house and returned to the hotel, I immediately called Richard Chen and explained what I had just learned about Amaris's plan to make false abuse allegations, and I sent him a copy of the audio recording that Rebecca had made so that he could review it and advise me on how to use it strategically in the divorce proceedings. Richard called me back within an hour after listening to the recording, and he said, "This recording is extremely valuable evidence that demonstrates your wife's willingness to fabricate abuse allegations for strategic purposes, and if she does attempt to make any claims about emotional abuse or controlling behavior during the divorce proceedings, we can use this recording to completely destroy her credibility and to show the court that she has been planning to lie in order to gain advantage in the settlement." Richard also explained that the recording might be useful even if Amaris didn't make explicit abuse allegations, because it showed a pattern of manipulative thinking and strategic dishonesty that would be relevant to the court's assessment of her credibility on any disputed issues, and he said that having this kind of evidence of premeditated deception was relatively rare in divorce cases and gave us a significant advantage in negotiations. Richard suggested that we should include a reference to the existence of the recording in our initial filing so that Amaris and her attorney would know that we had evidence of her planned false allegations, and that this knowledge might deter her from actually making those allegations because she would know that we could refute them immediately and demonstrate that she had been planning to lie. Over the next few days, I focused on maintaining my normal work routine and trying not to obsess over the divorce proceedings, and I received regular updates from Richard about the progress of the case, including the fact that Amaris had been successfully served with the divorce papers by a process server who had found her at our house and had delivered the documents in accordance with the legal requirements. Richard told me that Amaris now had 30 days to file a response to the divorce petition, and that her response would indicate whether she planned to contest any of the proposed terms regarding asset division, or whether she would accept the settlement as drafted. I was curious about how Amaris would respond, and whether she would try to fight for a larger share of the assets, or whether she would recognize that my evidence of her affair and her planned false accusations gave me significant leverage, and that her best option was to accept a reasonable settlement and move on. About a week after Amaris was served with the divorce papers, I received a text message from an unknown number that turned out to be from Lucas, the man Amaris had been having an affair with, and the message said, "I think we need to talk about what's happening with you and Amaris, because there are things you should know about the situation that might change your perspective on everything." I stared at this message for a long time, trying to decide whether to respond or to simply block the number and ignore any further attempts by Lucas to contact me, because I couldn't imagine what he could possibly tell me that would be relevant or that would change my decision to divorce Amaris. I decided to respond to Lucas's text message, not because I thought he could tell me anything that would change my decision to divorce Amaris, but because I was curious about what he might reveal and whether his version of events would provide additional evidence or context that could be useful in the divorce proceedings. I typed out a brief response that said, "I'm willing to meet with you once to hear what you have to say, but I want to be clear that nothing you tell me is going to change the fact that I'm divorcing Amaris, and I reserve the right to use anything you say as evidence in the divorce case if it becomes relevant." Lucas responded almost immediately agreeing to these terms and suggesting that we meet the following day at a coffee shop that was conveniently located halfway between our respective workplaces, and I agreed to the meeting time and location while simultaneously forwarding the entire text exchange to Richard Chen so that he would be aware of this development and could advise me on how to handle the conversation. Richard called me within minutes of receiving my forwarded messages, and he said, "I think meeting with Lucas could potentially be very useful because he might inadvertently reveal information that corroborates your timeline or that provides additional evidence of the affair. But I want you to be very careful about what you say during this meeting because anything you say could potentially be used against you if Lucas decides to share the conversation with Amaris or with her attorney." Richard advised me to keep the conversation focused on listening rather than talking, and to avoid making any threats or accusations that could be characterized as harassment or intimidation, and he also suggested that I should consider recording the conversation on my phone as long as I was in a one-party consent state where it was legal to record conversations without the other person's knowledge or permission. I checked the state law and confirmed that I was indeed in a one-party consent jurisdiction, which meant that I could legally record any conversation that I was a participant in without needing to inform the other party, and I made a mental note to start the recording on my phone before Lucas arrived at the coffee shop. The next day I arrived at the coffee shop about 15 minutes early and selected a table in a quiet corner where we could talk without being easily overheard by other customers, and I ordered a coffee and set up my phone on the table in a way that would allow it to record audio while appearing to be casually placed there rather than deliberately positioned for recording purposes. Lucas arrived exactly on time, looking professionally dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase, and he was taller and more conventionally handsome than I had expected, based on Amaris's descriptions of him, as someone who was kind and understanding rather than physically attractive. We shook hands awkwardly, and Lucas sat down across from me, and before he could start speaking, I said, "Before we begin this conversation, I want to make sure you understand that I'm going through a divorce with Amaris, and that anything you tell me today could potentially be used as evidence in those proceedings, so you should think carefully about what you want to say and whether you're comfortable with the possibility that your words might end up being part of a legal record." Lucas nodded and said, "I understand that, and I've thought carefully about whether to reach out to you at all, but I decided that you deserve to know the truth about what's been happening because I think Amaris has been lying to both of us and manipulating the situation in ways that neither of us fully understood until recently." I leaned back in my chair and said, "I'm listening," and Lucas took a deep breath and began talking in a way that suggested he had rehearsed what he wanted to say. He started by saying, "I want you to know that I'm not trying to excuse my behavior or to minimize my responsibility for having an affair with a married woman, because I knew that what we were doing was wrong and I knew that it would cause hurt and damage if it ever came to light. But I also want you to know that Amaris told me repeatedly that your marriage was essentially over and that you were staying together only for financial convenience and because neither of you wanted to deal with the hassle of a divorce." I felt a flash of anger at this claim because Amaris had never indicated to me that she was unhappy in our marriage or that she wanted a divorce until after the affair was exposed, but I forced myself to stay calm and to let Lucas continue talking without interrupting. Lucas went on, "Amaris told me that you were emotionally distant and that you spent all your time working and that you had no interest in spending time with her or investing in your relationship, and she said that she had tried multiple times to talk to you about these problems, but that you always dismissed her concerns or told her that she was being too demanding or too emotional." I recognized this narrative as a version of the same justification that Amaris had offered me during our meeting in the park, where she had tried to blame the affair on alleged emotional voids in our marriage, and I realized that she had been telling Lucas a carefully constructed story that painted me as a neglectful husband, and herself as a victim of an unhappy marriage who deserved sympathy and understanding. Lucas continued, "Based on what Amaris told me, I believed that I was helping her transition out of a dead marriage and that once she was ready to formally separate from you, we would be able to have a real relationship without all the secrecy and deception, and I know that sounds naive in retrospect, but at the time I convinced myself that what we were doing was justified because Amaris was essentially trapped in a loveless marriage and just needed time and support to work up the courage to leave. I finally spoke and said, "Did it ever occur to you to verify any of what Amaris was telling you, or to consider the possibility that she might be exaggerating or lying about the state of our marriage in order to justify the affair and to make you feel less guilty about being involved with a married woman?" Lucas looked uncomfortable and said, "I thought about that occasionally. especially when there were inconsistencies in things she told me or when her behavior didn't quite match up with the story she had given me about your marriage being dead, but I wanted to believe her because it made everything easier and because it allowed me to think of myself as someone who was helping a woman escape an unhappy situation rather than someone who was just having a selfish affair. I asked Lucas what had prompted him to reach out to me now, and he said, "Two things happened that made me realize that Amaris had been lying to me about the nature of your marriage and about her intentions regarding our relationship. First, about a week before the affair was exposed, Amaris told me that she had decided she wasn't ready to leave you yet because she needed more time to prepare financially and emotionally, and she asked me if I would be willing to continue our relationship in secret for at least another 6 months or possibly longer, which made me realize that her previous promises about being almost ready to file for divorce had been lies designed to keep me invested in the affair." Lucas paused and took a sip of his coffee, and then he continued. "The second thing that happened was that after the affair was exposed and you sent those screenshots to her family, Amaris called me in a panic and told me that I needed to support her story that you had been abusive and controlling during your marriage, and that if we coordinated our stories, we could make it seem like the affair was an understandable response to your mistreatment of her. And when I told her that I wasn't comfortable lying about abuse allegations, she got angry and told me that I owed her my support because she had risked everything for our relationship." I felt a cold rage building as Lucas described this conversation, because it confirmed that Amaris had indeed been planning to make false abuse allegations and that she had been trying to recruit Lucas to corroborate those false claims, and I realized that if Rebecca hadn't recorded Amaris's earlier conversation about this strategy, I might have found myself facing coordinated false accusations from both Amaris and Lucas that would have been much more difficult to refute. I said to Lucas, "Are you telling me that Amaris explicitly asked you to support false claims that I had been abusive or controlling, and that she framed this request as something you owed her because of your relationship?" Lucas nodded and said, "Yes, that's exactly what happened, and that conversation was what made me realize that Amaris was willing to do whatever it took to protect herself and to avoid taking responsibility for her own choices, including destroying your reputation and potentially your career with false abuse allegations." I asked Lucas if he would be willing to provide a written statement describing what Amaris had told him about our marriage and about her request that he support false abuse allegations, and I explained that having his testimony as a witness could be crucial in preventing Amaris from successfully making those false claims during the divorce proceedings. Lucas hesitated for a moment and said, "I'm willing to provide a statement, but I need you to understand that doing so will probably end my relationship with Amaris permanently and might also cause problems for me professionally if word gets out that I was involved in an affair with a colleague, because we work at the same consulting firm, and there are policies against undisclosed workplace relationships that could result in disciplinary action or termination for both of us." I said, "I understand your concerns about professional consequences, but I would think that you would be more concerned about the ethical and legal implications of allowing Amaris to make false abuse allegations that could seriously damage my reputation and my ability to earn a living, and I would also point out that if you refuse to tell the truth about what Amaris asked you to do, you become complicit in her plan to commit what is essentially fraud and defamation." Lucas looked down at his coffee cup and was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "You're right. I can't let her make false accusations without speaking up, regardless of what it costs me professionally or personally. So yes, I'll provide a written statement describing what Amaris told me and what she asked me to do." I thanked Lucas for his willingness to cooperate, and I gave him Richard Chen's contact information so that he could coordinate with my attorney regarding the preparation and submission of his statement, and then I asked Lucas one more question that had been bothering me since the beginning of our conversation. I said, "Given everything you now know about Amaris's willingness to lie and manipulate both of us, do you have any insight into what her endgame was, whether she actually intended to leave me and build a life with you, or whether the affair was always just about the excitement and attention, and she never had any real intention of ending our marriage?" Lucas was quiet again for a moment, and then he said, "Honestly, I don't know what her true intentions were, because she was so skilled at telling each of us exactly what we wanted to hear that it's hard to know what she actually believed or wanted, but based on some things she said toward the end of our relationship, I think she was trying to have it both ways. She wanted to maintain the financial security and social respectability of being married to you while also having the excitement and emotional intensity of a secret relationship with me. And I think she would have been happy to continue that arrangement indefinitely if she hadn't been caught. I nodded because this assessment matched my own conclusions based on the evidence I had compiled and the conversations I had had with Amaris since the affair was exposed, and I realized that the most painful aspect of the whole situation wasn't even the affair itself, but rather the recognition that Amaris had viewed our marriage primarily as a source of stability and resources while seeking emotional fulfillment elsewhere, and that she had been willing to sustain this duplicitous arrangement for as long as possible without any apparent concern for the impact on me or on our relationship. Lucas and I talked for a few more minutes about logistical details regarding his statement and his willingness to testify if necessary, and then we parted ways with an awkward handshake and a mutual acknowledgement that this conversation had been necessary even though it had been uncomfortable for both of us. When I returned to the hotel after my meeting with Lucas, I immediately called Richard Chen to update him on everything that had been discussed and to let him know that Lucas had agreed to provide a written statement that would corroborate my version of events and would document Amaris's attempt to recruit him to support false abuse allegations. Richard was pleased with this development and said that having Lucas as a witness would significantly strengthen our position, especially if Amaris tried to claim during the divorce proceedings that I had been controlling or abusive, because we would be able to show that she had explicitly planned to make those false allegations and had even tried to get her affair partner to support her fabricated story. Richard also pointed out that Lucas's testimony about what Amaris had told him regarding the state of our marriage would be valuable in refuting any claims she might make about having been trapped in an unhappy or dysfunctional relationship, because Lucas could testify that Amaris had told him conflicting stories at different times depending on what narrative served her purposes in the moment. Over the next week, I continued to stay at the extended stay hotel, while Amaris presumably packed her belongings and made arrangements to move out of our house, and I received periodic updates from Richard about the progress of the divorce case, including the fact that Amaris had retained her own attorney and was preparing to file a response to our petition. Richard warned me that Amaris's attorney might try to negotiate for a more favorable division of assets or might contest some of the terms we had proposed, and he said that we should be prepared for the possibility that the divorce might not be resolved as quickly or as cleanly as we had hoped if Amaris decided to fight rather than accept a reasonable settlement. I told Richard that I was prepared for a longer legal battle if necessary, but that I hoped Amaris would recognize that my evidence of her affair and her planned false allegations gave me significant leverage and that her best option was to accept fair terms and move on rather than dragging out the proceedings and potentially exposing herself to additional scrutiny and embarrassment. Around this time, I received an unexpected phone call from someone who identified herself as Claire Donovan, and the name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't immediately place where I had heard it before. And when I asked who she was and why she was calling, she explained that she worked at the same consulting firm as Amaris and Lucas, and that she had some information she thought I should know. I felt a sense of wariness because I wasn't sure whether this was someone who was calling on Amaris's behalf to try to manipulate me or gather information, or whether she was a genuine source of new information that could be relevant to my case, and I asked Claire to explain exactly what her relationship was to Amaris and Lucas and why she felt compelled to reach out to me. Claire said in a voice that was tight with controlled emotion, "I'm calling because I recently discovered that Lucas, who is my fiancé, has been having an affair with your wife for the past 6 months. And I found out about it only after someone at our office told me that there was an HR investigation being initiated into an undisclosed workplace relationship between Lucas and Amaris." I felt a shock of recognition as I processed what Claire was saying, because I suddenly remembered that Lucas had mentioned during our meeting that he was concerned about professional consequences from the affair, and I realized that the situation was even more complicated than I had understood, because Lucas hadn't just been having an affair with my wife, he had been engaged to someone else while conducting that affair, which meant that there were now 4 people whose lives had been significantly damaged by the deception and betrayal. I said to Claire, "I'm very sorry that you had to find out about the affair this way, and I know exactly how you're feeling right now because I went through the same shock and betrayal when I discovered what was happening, and if there's anything I can tell you or any information I can share that would be helpful to you, I'm willing to do that." Claire's voice broke slightly as she said, "I just need to understand what happened and how long this has been going on, because Lucas has been lying to me about so many things and I don't know what to believe anymore. And I thought that maybe if I talked to you, I could get a clearer picture of the truth rather than just relying on whatever version Lucas decides to tell me." I spent the next hour on the phone with Claire, sharing everything I knew about the timeline of the affair based on the evidence I had compiled, including the credit card charges and the text messages and the statements from Harper and Rebecca, and Claire told me that she had been noticing strange behaviors from Lucas over the past few months, but had rationalized them away because she trusted him and because she was focused on planning their wedding, which had been scheduled for 3 months from now. Claire said that the HR investigation at their consulting firm had been initiated by an anonymous complaint, and that both Lucas and Amaris were now being interviewed by HR about whether they had violated company policies regarding disclosure of workplace relationships. And she said that there was a possibility that one or both of them could face disciplinary action or even termination, depending on what the investigation uncovered. I asked Claire if she would be willing to share information with me about what she learned from the HR investigation, because I thought that any findings regarding workplace policy violations might be relevant to my divorce case as additional evidence of Amaris's deceptive behavior and poor judgment. Claire agreed to keep me informed about the HR investigation, and she also mentioned that she had been doing some investigating of her own and had discovered that Lucas had made several large cash withdrawals from their joint account over the past few months that he had never adequately explained, and she wondered whether those withdrawals might have been used to fund hotel stays or gifts for Amaris that wouldn't show up on credit card statements where they could be easily discovered. I found this information interesting because it suggested that Lucas had been more strategic about hiding evidence of the affair than I had given him credit for, and I made a mental note to ask Richard whether we could subpoena Lucas's bank records as part of the divorce discovery process to see if we could establish additional financial evidence of the affair that would corroborate the timeline I had already documented. Claire and I agreed to stay in contact and to share information as we both navigated the process of ending our respective relationships with people who had proven themselves to be dishonest and manipulative. And after we ended the call, I felt a strange sense of solidarity with her, because we were both dealing with the same fundamental betrayal of trust, and both trying to make sense of how we had been deceived by people we had believed we knew well. The next day, I received a call from Richard Chen informing me that Amaris's attorney had filed a response to our divorce petition, and that the response included some counterclaims and alternative proposals regarding the division of assets that we would need to review and respond to. Richard sent me a copy of Amaris's response, and as I read through it, I felt my anger rising because the document was filled with distortions and mischaracterizations of our marriage and of my behavior during the relationship, including claims that I had been emotionally unavailable and controlling, and that I had prioritized work over the marital relationship to such a degree that it created an untenable living situation for Amaris. The response also claimed that Amaris should be entitled to a larger share of the home equity because she had contributed significantly to the maintenance and improvement of the property through her unpaid domestic labor, which was a laughable claim given that we had employed a cleaning service for most of our marriage, and I had been the one who handled all of the actual home maintenance and repairs. More concerning was a section of Amaris's response that made vague references to psychological and emotional mistreatment that she had allegedly endured during our marriage. And while the response stopped short of making explicit abuse allegations, it was clearly laying the groundwork for such claims by creating a narrative of me as a cold and controlling husband who had made Amaris's life difficult. I called Richard immediately after reading the response and told him that I wanted to use Rebecca's recording and Lucas's statement to preemptively refute these characterizations, because I didn't want to let Amaris establish a false narrative that we would then have to spend time and energy disproving, and Richard agreed that we should file a comprehensive rebuttal that included all of our evidence of Amaris's affair, her planned false allegations, and her manipulative behavior. Richard said that he would draft a response that would include Rebecca's recording, Lucas's written statement, Harper's testimony, and all of the financial and electronic evidence I had compiled, and that this comprehensive filing would make it clear to Amaris and her attorney that we had overwhelming evidence to support our version of events and to refute any false claims about my behavior during the marriage. Over the next few days, I worked with Richard to prepare our rebuttal filing, and I provided him with all of the documentation and evidence I had compiled, including the detailed timeline, the credit card statements, the cloud storage metadata, Harper's written statement, Rebecca's audio recording, and Lucas's statement about Amaris's request that he support false abuse allegations. Richard incorporated all of this evidence into a comprehensive response that methodically refuted each of Amaris's claims and provided documentary proof that contradicted her characterization of our marriage and my behavior, and he also included a strongly worded section arguing that Amaris's willingness to make false or exaggerated claims about emotional mistreatment demonstrated a pattern of dishonesty and manipulation that should be considered by the court when evaluating her credibility on any disputed issues. When the rebuttal filing was complete, it was more than 40 pages long, including exhibits, and Richard said that it was one of the most thoroughly documented divorce responses he had ever prepared, and that he believed it would be very effective in establishing our credibility and in deterring Amaris from pursuing any strategy based on false allegations or distortions of fact. Around this same time, I learned from Claire that the HR investigation at the consulting firm had concluded and that both Lucas and Amaris had been found to have violated company policies by failing to disclose their romantic relationship, which created potential conflicts of interest because Lucas had been in a position to influence decisions about Amaris's work assignments and performance evaluations. Claire told me that Lucas had been suspended without pay for 2 weeks and had been issued a formal written warning that would remain in his personnel file, and that Amaris had been transferred to a different department and had been removed from several high-profile client projects as a result of the findings. Claire also mentioned that the firm's managing partners had made it clear to both Lucas and Amaris that any future policy violations would result in immediate termination, and that their professional reputations within the firm had been significantly damaged by the investigation and its findings, which would likely affect their career advancement opportunities for years to come. I felt a sense of grim satisfaction when I heard about these professional consequences, not because I took pleasure in other people's misfortune, but because it seemed appropriate that Amaris and Lucas should face some tangible repercussions for their deceptive behavior beyond just the personal relationship fallout, and I thought that having their professional judgment and ethics called into question by their employer might give them some incentive to be more honest and forthright in their dealings with me and with Claire as we worked through the divorce and separation processes. Claire told me that she had ended her engagement to Lucas immediately after learning the full extent of his lies and deception, and that she was in the process of canceling their wedding and notifying guests that the marriage would not be taking place, and she said that while the whole experience had been humiliating and painful, she was grateful that she had discovered Lucas's true character before marrying him, rather than after. Claire contacted me again about 2 weeks after our initial conversation and told me that she had been thinking about the situation and had come to the realization that both Lucas and Amaris deserved to face public accountability for their actions, rather than just private consequences that could be easily hidden or minimized. And she asked me if I would be willing to coordinate with her to create a moment of public exposure that would make it impossible for either of them to control the narrative or to avoid taking responsibility for what they had done. I was initially hesitant about this proposal because I wasn't sure what Claire had in mind, and I didn't want to do anything that could be characterized as harassment or that could potentially backfire and make me look vindictive or unstable. But Claire explained that she had been invited to a large professional networking event that both Lucas and Amaris would be attending as representatives of their consulting firm, and that she wanted to use that event as an opportunity to present the evidence of their affair and their deceptive behavior in a way that would be witnessed by their colleagues and professional contacts. Claire proposed that we both attend the networking event and that we arrange to have copies of key evidence documents available for anyone who wanted to review them, including the timeline of the affair, the HR investigation findings, and statements from witnesses who could corroborate the facts, and she suggested that we could simply make these documents available at a table near the entrance to the event with a sign indicating that they contained important information about professional ethics and workplace relationships. I consulted with Richard Chen about whether this plan could create any legal problems for me, and he said that as long as we were only distributing factual information that could be verified through documentation, and as long as we weren't making false statements or engaging in harassment, there shouldn't be any legal liability, although he cautioned that Amaris and Lucas might respond by attempting to create a public scene or by making accusations against us that we would then need to refute. I decided to move forward with Claire's plan because I agreed with her assessment that both Amaris and Lucas had been able to avoid full accountability for their actions by controlling who knew what information and by presenting different versions of events to different audiences, and I thought that creating a moment where the truth was publicly available and undeniable would serve an important purpose in terms of establishing a clear record and preventing them from continuing to manipulate and deceive people. Claire and I spent several days preparing the documentation and organizing the evidence into clear, professional-looking packets that could be easily reviewed and understood, and we coordinated our arrival at the networking event to ensure that we would be there early enough to set up our information table before the majority of attendees arrived and before Lucas and Amaris had any opportunity to prevent us from distributing the materials or to try to spin the situation in their favor before people had a chance to see the evidence for themselves. The networking event was held at an upscale hotel conference center downtown, and it was one of those large professional gatherings where consultants and business executives and other corporate professionals would mingle and exchange business cards and discuss potential collaborations. And the attendee list included not just people from Lucas and Amaris's firm, but also clients and potential clients and other industry contacts who would be important to their professional reputations and career prospects. Claire and I arrived 90 minutes before the official start time and spoke with the event coordinator about setting up a small information table near the registration area. And we explained that we had materials related to professional ethics and workplace conduct that we wanted to make available to attendees, and the coordinator agreed to let us set up the table as long as we weren't selling anything or soliciting business in a way that would violate the event rules. We arranged 60 evidence packets on the table in neat rows, and each packet contained a one-page executive summary that outlined the key facts of the affair and the deceptive behavior, followed by supporting documentation, including excerpts from Harper's statement, key portions of Rebecca's recorded conversation with Amaris about planning false abuse allegations, Lucas's written statement about Amaris's request that he support those false allegations, a summary of the HR investigation findings, and a timeline showing the progression of the affair over 6 months. Claire had also included photographs of text messages between Lucas and herself, where he had lied about his whereabouts on dates that corresponded with documented meetings with Amaris, which provided additional corroboration of the deceptive behavior pattern. We placed a simple sign on the table that read, "Professional Ethics and Accountability, a Case Study in Workplace Relationships," and we positioned ourselves behind the table, ready to answer questions from anyone who wanted more information about what the packets contained. As attendees began arriving and checking in for the event, many of them noticed our table and picked up packets out of curiosity, and we watched as people read through the executive summary and then either set the packet down and moved on or took it with them as they entered the main conference area. About 30 minutes after the event officially started, I saw Lucas and Amaris arrive together and approach the registration desk, and I watched as they noticed our table and then as recognition dawned on their faces when they saw Claire and me standing behind it. Amaris's face went pale, and Lucas looked like he had been physically struck, and they both stood frozen for a moment as if trying to decide whether to leave immediately or to try to confront us, and I could see Lucas saying something to Amaris in a low, urgent voice while she shook her head repeatedly. Before either of them could decide what to do, several people who had already picked up evidence packets approached Lucas and Amaris and began asking them questions about the information in the documents, and I saw Amaris trying to maintain her composure while explaining that the packets contained false information that had been compiled by vindictive ex-partners who were trying to damage their reputations. But several people pointed out that the packets included official HR investigation findings and sworn statements from multiple witnesses, which would be difficult to fabricate or falsify. Lucas attempted to steer Amaris away from the growing group of curious colleagues and toward the exit. But as they tried to leave, they were stopped by Michael Patterson, who was one of the managing partners at their consulting firm, and who had apparently picked up one of the evidence packets and read through it carefully. Michael asked Lucas and Amaris to step aside with him for a private conversation, and even from across the room I could see that Michael's expression was serious and that he was asking pointed questions, while Lucas and Amaris both tried to explain or justify their behavior, and after several minutes of conversation I saw Michael shake his head and say something that caused both Lucas and Amaris to look devastated. Claire leaned over and whispered to me that Michael was known for being extremely strict about professional ethics and for having zero tolerance for behavior that could damage the firm's reputation with clients or industry partners, and she speculated that he was probably telling them that they needed to leave the event immediately and that there would be further consequences when they returned to the office. Within minutes, Lucas and Amaris left the conference center together, and I noticed that Amaris was crying and that Lucas looked shell-shocked as they walked quickly toward the exit without making eye contact with any of the other attendees who were watching them leave. Claire and I remained at our information table for another hour as more attendees picked up evidence packets and as several people stopped to ask us questions about the situation and to express support for our decision to make the information public. And by the end of the evening, all 60 packets had been distributed, and Claire and I both felt that we had accomplished what we set out to do, which was to ensure that Lucas and Amaris faced public accountability for their deceptive behavior and that their professional reputations would reflect the reality of their ethical failures rather than whatever sanitized narrative they might have tried to construct.